Hello, good afternoon. Pardon me while my wife destroys the house with throwing cat water all over the place. Yep, she dropped a thing. It was full of water and she made a crazy sound. All right, what day is it? It's Wednesday, July 10th in the afternoon. And this morning we started adding some details to what a townsperson looks like in in regards to generating these townspeople. And we started having to think about, well, how do we pick a species and how are we going to store all of this stuff and what information goes with the species and all of that stuff. And we started getting into details about um, rule sets and how they're going to be implemented, how they differ from one game system to the next or one version of the game system to the next. And I think to keep things simpler for now, we're just going to focus on D&D 5e, and we're going to only use what's in the system reference document, just so that I don't get a bunch of lawyers from a giant corporation come knocking on my door and telling me to stop. So I downloaded the system reference document for the 5e rule set, the one that's been added to the Creative Commons by attribution license. And I actually did the legalese stuff down here in this rule set itself, wherever I put it. Here's RulesetAccess, SpeciesData. Is this Game Tools rule set D&D? Okay, good. And then I got to come up here, and we'll see here in the File Explorer view that I've added this license.txt file up here. That it's copied and pasted directly from the system reference document. So hopefully that's sufficient to keep me out of the shark pool that Hasbro's lawyers like to swim in. So we need to create a bunch of lists of species. And we know that all of these game systems are going to list different species that we can pick from. And so we almost ran into something horrible called a circular reference in this morning's session. I started defining classes and templates and all kinds of things up here in the 5e SRD assembly or project. And I realized, well, gosh, if I'm going to be able to serve these, I need to be able to serve them from RulesetAccess, but I want to define all the common bits for these concepts when we create a game system specific rule set. I need a centralized place to define those things. And then, of course, I'm referencing this rule set down in my console client. But the console client is eventually going to, it already references the Townsfolk Manager, which eventually is going to reference the RulesetAccess. And if it's referencing both, we're going to end up with a circular dependency. And the compilers really, really don't like that a whole awful lot. Like it'll fail to build if we create circular references or circular dependencies. So what we've basically done, and I want to bring up just something that I can scribble on here. I'm actually going to load up Draw.io. And we'll let it do its thing. Let's just create a new diagram. We'll make it blank. So we've got our client app up here. And then it references our managers. or our manager. Our manager references our dice engine and our rule set access. Rule set access. Now, the rule set access doesn't contain the rules. It allows us to access them. Rule set resource. Now, I could hard code client app to manager to dice engine to rule set access, and then hard code rule set access to reference our rule sets. But I'm not crazy about that, because that tightly couples all of this stuff. I'd rather have these rule sets drop-inable. I'd rather have these rule sets a little bit more dynamic so that I can completely separate that rule set from the overall solution, even though it lives in the solution with us. And I want the client app to choose the rule set, or to tell the manager which rule set it's going to use when generating an NPC. And then, of course, when the manager spins up its rule set access component, it's going to pass that rule set into the component so that it's all nice and simple. Now, in order for that to work, we need to have our rule sets comply with some standard contracts that allow the rule set access component to reliably call into them to get to execute the various kinds of rules. So before we go too much further on the details of a rule set, like describing species lists and all that stuff, let's think about this rule set access. And when I'm just starting with a new component, or I have to do some detailed design, and I'm dealing with an empty project, and I don't know what things look like yet, but I've got a vague idea. So rule set access, we've got some contracts in here, but we don't really have anything specific to the contracts. We've got a class. We're not sure what it is, but let's actually use this class to define or help us figure out what this thing needs to do. Now, before I go any further and define any more code inside this, I got to come in here, get rid of these darn implicit usings, disable those, save it, item group folder include contracts. I don't love that, but we'll deal. Rule set access. So I also don't like these top level statements. All right. And I know that eventually we're going to need using game tools dot rule set access dot contracts. And there's nothing in contracts yet. So I'm going to add a new file. We'll add an interface, and I'm just going to call it RulesetAccess. There we go. Let it add. Fix this. Come down here, grab this. X, V, indent. And I've got reasons why I don't like top level files, but I can't enumerate them yet. Contracts, RulesetAccess, dot contracts. Save that. Our class has tidied itself up. And I'm going to call this RulesetProvider, and it's going to implement RulesetAccess. And we got to rename the class file to RulesetProvider. There we go. All right. So what does a RulesetProvider do? Well, it doesn't necessarily get a rule set, but yeah, we'll discover these operations as we go. First thing I want to do, question. What does a RulesetAccess component do? Answer. It provides access to specific operations within specific implementations of operations within a given set of game rules. What kind of rules exist within a rule set? A, within a, let's TTRPG rule set. And let's TTRPG, because we're not going to scope this to be able to run a game of Parcheesi or checkers or roll dice and go around the board and buy properties and make your friends mad or anything like that. Character generation rules, combat rules, and let's say action rules, resource management rules, We only care about those. So within RulesetAccess, we are going to need to have a method that returns the character generation rules. Now, what does that mean? We're going to return an object, but we don't know what that object is yet. We're going to be identifying that very, very shortly. And we are going to be load generator rules. So our generator let's change that to load character generator rules. All right. So we're going to have rules that apply to characters. And within characters, we're going to have a component, I, character rules. I, generator rules. And of course, I jumped the gun and didn't say I want an interface. I want generator rules. And our generator rules, well, we need to be able to choose the species template. We're going to talk about this template idea in a little bit. And we are going to have choose background template. And we'll have choose vocation template. So if that's going to work, we're going to need to be able to pass back a species template. Choose species template. And we don't know what a species template is yet because we haven't referenced the definitions. So we're going to add a new project reference and it's going to be definitions. And again, we've got this top level namespace, which I don't like. I feel like this needs to be a to-do item where I figure out how to make that stop happening using game tools dot ruleset dot definitions. And there's our species template. Now, how do we want to choose a species template? Well, we could publish the count of the species that are exposed by a particular rule set, or we could pass in our number generator, or we could do something else, or we could pass in the name of a species. So I think what we need to do is have a number of different ways to filter or select. So how can we choose a species? Pass in its name, selected from a list. Count the available choices and generate a random number and pick that choice. Some other way. So species template, choose species template. I think what we need to do is we need to expose a list. Not a list. We're going to do this as a string array. String array. Get species. And this one retrieves a list of species we can use when building a character. And I have a guest in my Twitch chat, pseudohacks. Hello, pseudohacks. How are you? And it returns a string, an array, not an array of species names. All right, so there's that. So we got to get species somehow. Now, this interface is defined in our RulesetAccess. And our definitions, we've got species template, we've got species data down here, which is a class, list species, get species template, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that really belongs down here. I think our definitions, excuse me, needs to contain a characters namespace. Here it is. We're going to add a new file. And we are going to call, it's going to be a class. And we're going to call this species data. Now our species data is going to have, pseudohacks asks in the chat, what am I building right now? I am using my need as a dungeon master to have a quick way of creating non-player character details, because my characters, when I run game, are always asking me, what's the blacksmith's name? What do they look like? Is he grumpy? Is it a girl? Stuff like that. And I'm really bad at coming up with that stuff on the fly. And I'm really bad about remembering what I said when I do come up with it on the fly. So I'm building a little .NET application that's going to maybe help me with some of that. Primarily what I'm doing is I'm using that particular real life problem to demonstrate how you can think through solving real world problems with software. I'm just using it as sort of like a contrived example to kind of demonstrate and discuss some more wide-reaching software engineering concerns. So species data, that is going to be our base class. Public base, no, abstract. We're not going to have any parameters. That goes away. Private, read-only, list of species template, species templates, and species templates is a new list of those. Great. Rule set provider is still horribly broken, but that's okay. And public string array, load list species. We're going to make it a read-only property, but doing it as a lambda isn't great because it's going to be a multi-line function. And var species list equals species templates dot select. We haven't defined any properties on the templates yet, but we're just going to select name dot to array. And then we're going to return the species list. Save. This is not a method, so we don't need the parentheses. There we go. All right, species template, that is defined in our definitions. Let's pull species template up into characters. This, come on, you're going to let me move you? Move. Ah. Definitions dot character. So just character or characters? Characters. Save. And again, these darn top level statements. Pop it in. Defines the properties that are common to concept of a TTRPG species. And saving that. Public string name get set. And I'm going to make this init. Save. Constructor, nope. Get rid of the parameters. Name equals string.empty. The output for the exact for this exact solution, it could be some kind of server running code, but right now it's just a console app. The way I've structured it, and I can collapse things and pause for a moment. Man, I've got a lot of broken code in here. That's okay, we're going to fix it. I have a console client that references a manager. The manager provides the actual use cases, or the manager executes the use cases in our system. And the manager executes those use cases by referencing worker components. Those worker components fall into either engines or access to some resource. And then it stitches the capabilities from those worker components together to actually execute our use case. And each one of these will compile down to a DLL. And if I need to, say, separate it out into a set of microservices, I can host each of these DLLs within a service host, or I can compose them all into sort of a well-factored monolith or behind a web API or what have you. Right now, I'm just running out the console so that we can more concisely see the output as we go. Once I've fixed this red code, I'll run the console client and we'll be able to actually see what it spits out. Right now, it doesn't spit out much. Excuse me. All right, so we'll come back into species data is very unhappy. List of species template. I'm going to need to copy that, paste it here, dot characters, save it. What are you complaining about? There we go. Oh, because I did it as a namespace, not a using. And that's one of the reasons why I so strongly dislike this top level statement stuff, is it really messes with my head. And in my opinion, yeah, it increases the indentation levels by a tab, but that's fine. I feel like this is a lot more readable. So we can list our species. We've got species data. Yeah. Very good. This is an abstract class. And our generator rules is to return a species template. We need to fix this. So we're going to use ruleset.definitions.characters. Great. We don't need to use system yet. We may never. Save it. It's a dotNet thing. And the getter, are you talking specifically about in here, this list species? Okay, so with C#, we can define a get and a set. Species with that getter. So we can define a get and a set, and we can either explicitly define it if we've got multi-line code. Now, I could have public string array get, let's just say, species names. I could have done it like this. templates.select x.names, and then come all the way out here and done the .toArray, like so. And then just for readability's sake, I can pop down here. And I like to only have one dot per line, and that's perfectly legal, the way to do this, like for a read-only property. But maybe I'm old-fashioned because I've been doing this since the early 2000s, and we didn't have things like lambda functions or lambda expressions or expression body properties or anything like that. This is personal preference, maybe, but when it's a complex statement where I've got to do chained calls over a Fluent API, or if I've got a multi-line function that gets that read-only property value, I prefer to do it this way, which is kind of the old-fashioned way. To me, it's a lot more readable. And then if I'm worried about how much vertical space it's taking, I can always just collapse it in the IDE. So the reason being personal preference. I like seeing things a little bit or a lot more explicitly drawn out in front of me, rather than perhaps, a new slick way that takes less keystrokes. I vastly prefer easily readable to using the lambda expressions as property bodies and stuff like that. What do you normally work in if you're not working with dotNet? Okay, so we've got that stuff sort of laid out. We don't have any information in our species data yet, but I need to strip all of this stuff out. So, goodbye. Public class. We're going to seal this. Sealed class, species data, and it's going to inherit from species data. But I'm going to call it species 5E SRD. Okay, so either JavaScript or Java. Okay. I'm not a big fan of using JavaScript on the server. And again, it might be just because of what I'm used to, and that I've been, I'm old and set in my ways. But there's a lot of stuff that I just can't square with with how I think about server versus client and so on. Yes, it's very nice to be able to do all of your client work in JavaScript and all of your server work in JavaScript. I prefer to do all of my server work in .NET or .NET and C Sharp. And so I'll typically use ASP.NET Core for I'll use ASP.NET Core for MVC applications, or I've even seen people build hybrid solutions where the APIs are all done in .NET and the UI is done in React or Angular or Vue or whatever. I'm primarily a backend guy, so I vastly prefer using a compiled language on the server. The idea of having sensitive code that exists just purely as a text file really kind of bugs me, from a security point of view. I mean, yeah, you put your server stuff behind a firewall and all of that and so on, but and that's fine until you take the point of view where what if the bad guys are already in my network? And as soon as you start approaching your system design as if the bad guys have root inside your firewall, your whole mindset changes as to how you develop services and so on. Because if the bad guys are inside your firewall and your service implementations are in clear text files, you're sunk. But if it's compiled code that's binary signed by the build process and signed with a certificate, and your operating system has a constraint on it that says only execute signed code and all that stuff, it makes it a whole lot harder for the bad guys to make your services do horrible, horrible things. At least with compiled code. All right, so our species 5e SRD, it's inheriting species data. We've got list species, yeah. We've got our list of species templates. And so we also know that all of our species templates are going to have a name. Now, I don't like where this species template class is defined, so I'm going to grab this whole thing. And I hate that Visual Studio Code doesn't let me just drag and drop files from one part of my solution to another. That makes me insane. But I'm on a Mac, and Visual Studio for the Mac ceases to exist in about a month. Okay, right now we've got a naming conflict. Yep, but that's okay because that is about to go bye-bye. Yep, see you later. And we're back. Good. So we've got our definitions, 5e SRD, references, definitions, good. Our species data, I'm going to change this and say species 5e SRD. Very good. Yes, Visual Studio for Mac is being discontinued in August of this year. They stopped supporting it about a year ago, and it's going to cease to exist come August. I'm using Visual Studio Code. It's a little less feature rich. It's got a lot fewer automations and toys and so on that I am used to, because when I'm programming for somebody else, they usually give me a Windows box and I can install the full version of Visual Studio on that, and I'm a much happier, productive camper. Visual Studio Code, though, is good enough for simple things. So I rule set provider, I rule set access. We're going to have to implement this. Boom, there it goes. We got to load the character generator rules, whatever. Are we fully compilable right now? We are. So you wanted to see what kind of output we have. Are they replacing Visual Studio with Visual Studio Code at this point? I think for non-Windows developers, yes. For developers that work in Windows, I think we're going to see Visual Studio stick around for a good long time. And I hope that's the case, because there's a ton of automation and other things that I've come to rely on like a crutch over my long career developing in .NET. And if I lose those capabilities, it's going to set me back while I relearn all of the manual stuff that I have to do with Visual Studio. Just before I keep going with hashing out how we're going to deal with all of this stuff, I do want to show how the console app, or how its output behaves. So I'm just going to do a .NET run. This is already in the console client projects folder, and it's building. and I've got this great big giant townsperson class, and it really hated something. Type or namespace characters does not exist in the namespace. Ruleset.definitions. I probably have to rebuild. That's okay. We'll rebuild. Rebuild all the things. So to go back to your question, I hope they don't replace the full-fledged Visual Studio on Windows with VS Code. I know a lot of people like it, but for me, it's like going from a fully equipped workshop with power tools and all kinds of machines that make certain tasks easier to trying to build a house with nothing but a hammer, a box of nails, and a handsaw. Let's see if it'll run this time. Because the build passed is showing me a couple of problems, but I suspect those are warnings. So right now it's creating a new instance of the townsperson class, and I'm populating all of these things with defaults for now. Right now I'm working through a flexible way to start populating those properties. If we go back to our manager, right now I'm just populating the species with elf. And did that even show up in the display? Oh yeah, species is elf. But that's not very random. That's not very random at all. So what's going to happen is our manager is eventually going to receive a reference to an iRuleset provider, or an iRulesetAccess component that's manifested as our ruleset provider. And we're going to call load character generator rules, and that's going to give us a number of classes that let us do things like list the species, choose a species template, etc., etc. So right now, the only thing I'm trying to do is make sure that all of these abstractions and all of these implementations are aligned. Species data, yeah, that's fine. We can get rid of that. You can go away. Oh, did I? So here's this. That's the base class. This doesn't seem to exist anymore. Let's go ahead and create it. Species data. Rename to 5E provider. Boom. Golly, what did I do? Something goofy happened. Create it. All right, speciesdata.cs. Namespace is game tools dot ruleset dot dnd 5esrd. And here I am doing those darn top level statements. Public class species provider. It inherits species data from ruleset.definitions. And initialize species templates. There we go. Now, down here, species data as a base class. Well, every rule set is going to need to initialize its own species data. And I am not using a database with this. I'm just going to hard code the data that we need to be able to generate these NPCs into these various rule set implementations. But because we've got RulesetAccess defined very abstractly, I could conceivably create a Postgres or a MySQL or a Microsoft SQL database that holds all of this template data and then just query this stuff out. But for the purposes of this particular project, I'm just going to hard code it because the actual data inside a particular rule set ain't going to change all that often. And I am going to make this internal abstract initialize templates. And it's got to be internal abstract void initialize templates. There's that. It wants us to implement the abstract class. Internal override void, no suitable method found to override. What are you talking about? You're out of your mind. Species data dot initialize templates. There's initialize templates. Save it. Let's build it. See if that compiler warning goes away. The runtime compiler here in Visual Studio Code is sometimes a little bit cranky. Let's come back here, initialize templates. That's fine. That's okay. Why is it grumping about this? Tell me what it's grumping about. I'm going to use Codium. Oh, go away. I've been working at this project for about a week and a half, but I've only been working on it maybe a couple hours a day. So initialize templates. This is being silly. Let's comment this. GUI, 5e provider, this. Fix all implement abstract class. Well, first off, I want to rename the file to that. Now, let's try implementing the abstract class. Initialize templates, no suitable method found to override. Why are you being like this? This is incredibly silly. All right. Anyway, species data needs to be not private, because I'm going to be adding things to this list of species template from the children of this. Protected. And that's the problem, because internal means it's only visible to other classes within the same assembly or package if you're in Java speak. And protected override void. There's that. Now, is this thing going to get pissy at me when I seal the class? Nope. Good. So initialize templates is invisible outside of the D&D 5e SRD set of classes and interfaces and stuff. And what I had it marked as internal over on the base class in our definitions project, internals are invisible to classes that are extending outside of the current project. So species template elf template equals new species template elf template dot name equals elf. And again, nice and explicit. Elf template dot name. It doesn't like that. Oh, because I'm a silly. I've made it an init only property, but I'm not allowing it to be passed data anywhere. Public species template string name. Name equals name. There we go. Species 5e provider. We're going to take this, cut it, paste it as a string. Come on, Rob. Okay. And let's do template. Whoop. Template dwarf equals new species template dwarf. Now, I want to create a whole list of every species. You can inherit classes from another project. We do it in dotNet all the time. For instance, entity framework for dotNet that makes it easier to talk to relational databases. It contains a whole bunch of base classes that wrap up the GUI insides of connecting to a database service that are pretty much the same from one instance of a database to another, to another, to another. And then in our own projects, we'll inherit a DB context, for instance, and then we'll add our own references to tables or stored procedures or views or whatever SQL objects we need access to from that DB context. But the parent DB context class contains all of the gnarly code that involves making the network connection to the remote service and all that stuff. So species template, elf template, and so up here in our base class, our species templates, I am not really in love with this existing as a protected read only list. Well, no, I'm fine with it. But what I am going to do is protected void register species. And we're going to accept a species template. And dot species templates dot add the template. Save it. And there we go. So over here in our 5e provider, I'm going to say register elf template. Yeah, I'm just going to do these one at a time. Register dwarf template. No. Register species dwarf template. Now, I could try to rely on my old man memory for all the species that are and are not available in the 5e SRD. Or I could go to OpenAI, or rather, I could go to Wizards of the Coast and download the 5e system reference document that was released to Creative Commons under attribution license last year. And I could download that PDF and I can go over to OpenAI and start a chat with a custom GPT that somebody else made that lets me chat with a PDF. And I can upload the version of the system reference document that I just downloaded from Wizards over to ChatGPT, and then I can start asking questions. And what I want to do is please list the main character races in the SRD. For each race, print each race on its own line, formatted like this. Do not include subraces. All right, great. So now what am I going to do? I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to come over here. I'm going to paste those, and I've already got my comments. We've already done dwarf and elf. And so I normally like to be explicit with the variable types that I'm defining, but I'm getting lazy. No, don't get lazy. Let's give some space in between each one of these things. And I'm going to copy. And I'm going to paste. Oh, VS Code. Sometimes you are so stupid. I'm going to change this name to Halfling. Come out here, change the value of the race name to Halfling. And we're going to register Halfling template. and so on down the line. I'm not going to make people watch me do this for each and every possible choice here. That would be silly. What I do want to do is see about getting, what's my problem in the rule set over here? Does not implement inherited abstract member species data dot initialize templates. Bullshit, it doesn't. Pardon my language. Species data, oh, stop that. Species 5e provider. Are you going to let me refresh this view? Why is it being a silly git? Species 5e provider, species 5e SRD. Let's delete this. Goodbye. Yeah, move that to trash. Delete data. Yeah, that's empty. That can go away. Get lost. Species 5e provider. We've got a couple of species in here. And they're just stubs. They're not fully fleshed out or anything like that. But it's enough that I should be able to, out here in my console app, I want to close this, reload my Solution Explorer. Okay, our problems are gone. I'm going to rebuild. And it's determining the projects to restore. It doesn't have to restore any NuGet packages because I haven't referenced any. All right, and that seems to be good. Good. Let's come down to my console client. Good, good, good. That's all done. Print NPC. I don't need to print an NPC yet. So I am going to pull this. Control X. Static void test NPC gen. Paste it there. It's going to need a reference to the generator. Paste that there. Okay, we're not going to call it. What I do want to do is var RuleSet5e equals new species 5e provider. Is that what I called it? Yeah, it is. Forgot to call my base class constructor. That needs a using. Whoops. I'm flipping all over the place. And all I'm going to do is test species list. And I'm going to pass my RuleSet5e, bonk, save. Static void test species list. And down here, var species list equals RuleSet5e.list species. Yeah, do it. Save it. Build it. It's building. You can watch that in the background. That's all freaking out. This may or may not work. We'll see. .NET run. If it doesn't work, I'll actually debug it from inside VS Code and step in and see what's going on. We've got elves and dwarves and halflings. Fantastic. So the basic idea of that 5e rule set, or that species provider for 5e, it's doing approximately what we want to do. Tomorrow, we're going to pick up and we're going to do some hefty computer engineering tomorrow. We're not going to necessarily work on features within the rule set or building up the townsfolk generator, like the actual selecting species and applying properties from it and so on. We're going to get in a dependency injection because, like I said earlier, our rule set is just a resource. And I want the manager to tell the resource access class where to get the resource to access, or perhaps even provide the resources that we're going to access. So instead of having the rule set access directly reference the specific rule set, I'm going to take our D&D 5e SRD rule set, instantiate it all the way out here in the client, which in this case could be a console, it could be an API, it could be whatever, but it's the client that's going to pick and load that rule set assembly and provide that to my townsfolk generator, essentially saying, I need a townsperson NPC generated using this set of rules. And then the manager is going to say, okay, well, I'm going to pass this to the rule set access component. If I were using a database, I wouldn't be passing an entire .NET assembly or a Java package if I were doing this in Java. I'd pass a connection to a database or a connection to some remote service. But the code in the rule set, or the way the manager would talk to the rule set, doesn't change no matter how that rule set is expressed. I would have to write the code that would implement an API call to load my rule sets or a database query or whatever. But I'm doing this, these hard-coded in-class, basically collections of strings, organized collections of strings. I'm doing it in a .NET assembly. So we're going to get to pass this guy all the way out down to the rule set access component. And then the manager, he's only going to talk to that rule set access. It's not going to be directly calling into anything in that 5e SRD assembly. And that's it for me today. I am unemployed, so I got to go do stuff like apply for jobs and get ready for interviews and all that fun stuff. I'm doing this basically because I've learned an awful lot of things over my 20 years as a software developer, and I felt like I'm moving into the third act of my career, and I want to share all the stuff that's collected in my head so that maybe somebody who's newer can learn from some of the mistakes I've made, or can just pick up the things that I've learned and expand on those. Or maybe somebody who's got just as much or more experience as me could use a different perspective on some of the ways they approach problems. Not necessarily my perspective is better, but it's different, and it might cause a train of thought that leads them to a place that solves a problem. So that's why I'm doing this. Until tomorrow, I'll be streaming again at 10. I'll see you later. And yeah, if you haven't already subscribed, please do. Or not subscribed, but followed. I'm not an affiliate. I can't do subscriptions yet. But Thanks for joining me. Thanks for your great questions. I think you really added to the stream this afternoon because you asked some very important questions and it gave me an excuse to make some very important statements around software engineering theory. So thank you. I appreciate you being here. And to everybody else who's catching this after the fact, be kind to yourselves. Don't beat yourselves up too much. Coding can be hard. Just be patient. You'll get through it. And I'll see y'all later.